Okay, we're up to the chapter on peak oil, and this one is a doozy. If you think all the way back to chapter 3, I said I was going to connect the 3 E's, and we are now about to connect the economy to energy. This is one of the most important chapters. It's a big subject, and I wish to acknowledge that much of this chapter stands on the shoulders of the hundreds of dedicated people who have gathered the data, made the points, and tirelessly worked to advance our understanding of the role of energy in our lives. Energy is the lifeblood of any economy, but when an economy is based on an exponential debt-based money system, and that is based on exponentially increasing energy supplies, the supply of that energy deserves your very highest attention. And when we look at U.S. energy use, we see in this chart from the Department of Energy that oil represents over 50% of our total yearly energy use, while oil and natural gas together represent over 75%. We're going to examine oil in detail, although pretty much everything I'm about to say about oil applies equally to natural gas. So we'll be discussing more than 3/4 of our total energy situation. In order to understand what peak oil means, we need to share a common understanding about how oil fields work and how oil is extracted. A common misperception is that an oil rig is plunked down over an oil field, a pipe is inserted, and then oil gushes out from a big underground lake or cavern that eventually gets sucked dry. It turns out that it's pretty much just solid rock down there, and oil is only found in porous rocks like sandstone that permit the oil to flow through the rock's crevices and pores. No vast caverns or lakes of oil exist down there. Oil has to be very carefully extracted from what turns out to be a solid rock matrix. It's better to think of an oil field like a margarita, where the oil is the tequila mix and the rock is the crushed ice. When an oil field is tapped, we find that the amount of oil that comes out of it follows a very prescribed pattern over time that ends up resembling a bell curve. At first, shortly after the drink is discovered, there's just one straw in our margarita, but then, with growing excitement, more and more straws are stuck in, and more drink flows out of the glass at a faster rate. But then that dreaded slurping sound begins, and now, no matter how many new straws we insert, the amount of margarita coming out of the glass declines until it is all gone, and we're only left with ice. That's pretty much how an oil field works. Every oil field exploited to date has exhibited the same basic extraction profile. And what is true for one is equally true when we measure across many oil fields and then sum the result. Because individual fields peak, so do collections of fields. Peak oil, then, is not an abstract theory so much as it is a description of an extremely well-characterized physical process. How much remains to be discovered is a theory, but the process by which oil fields become depleted is rather well understood. Peak oil is simply a fact. Also, peak oil is not synonymous with running out of oil. At the moment of peak, somewhere right around half the oil still remains. But something interesting happens at the halfway mark. Where oil gushed out under pressure at first, the back half usually has to get laboriously pumped out of the ground at higher cost. Where every barrel of oil was cheaper to extract on the way up, the reverse is true on the way down. Each barrel becomes more costly in terms of time and money and energy to extract. Eventually, it costs more to extract a barrel of oil than it is worth, and that's when an oil field is abandoned. Here's our experience with oil in the United States. From the first well drilled in 1859 in Titus, Pennsylvania, until 1970, more and more oil was progressively pumped out of the ground. But after that point, less and less came out of the ground. It is said then that the U.S. hit a peak of oil production at around 1970 at just under 10 million barrels a day, and today produces just a little over 5 million barrels a day. Those are the facts. Counting only our crude oil consumption here, the remaining balance of our 15 million barrel a day crude oil habit is met by imports. That is, we import 2/3 of our daily petroleum needs. Now, in order to produce oil, you have to first find the oil, right? It's pretty hard to pump something you haven't found. Here's the interesting part. U.S. oil discoveries peaked in 1930, which yields a gap between a peak in discovery and a peak in production of 40 years. Remember that number. Here's an interesting aside. Suppose we wanted to become independent from imported oil and decided to replace those 10 million imported barrels with some other form of energy. Those 10 million barrels represent the same energy equivalent as 750 nuclear power plants. Considering the issues we have with 104 we have operating right now, I think it's safe to say nuclear power is not a realistic candidate for eliminating oil imports. Well then, by how much would we have to increase, say, our solar, wind, biomass, renewable energy production? There, we'd have to increase our currently installed base by a factor of 2,000. Not 2,000%, 2,000 times as much. When we look at worldwide oil discoveries, we find that those increased in every decade up to the 1960s, and then have decreased in every decade since then, with future projections looking even more grim. The exact peak of discovery? That was in 1964, 44 years ago, and that is another cold, hard, indisputable fact. Remember, in order to produce oil, you have to find it first. So to all the advocates out there who hope that lots of oil remains to be found, possibly of an abiotic origin, I say, let's find it. And here is the third and final fact about production that I want to present. This is a chart of global, conventional crude oil production only. It leaves out biofuels and some other liquids. But conventional crude is the easy, high energy yield stuff, and that is what the world's past 100 years of growth has been built upon. We can see here that since mid-2004, for some reason, oil production has been flat. Whatever the reason for this is, it isn't price, because oil has climbed from $50 a barrel to $120 a barrel as of today. If ever there was a strong incentive to get oil out of the ground and off to market, this would be it. Is it possible, then, that this chart is telling us that conventional crude oil production is at peak? The twin signals of rapidly rising price and flat production certainly make a compelling argument that this is the case. Intriguingly, the global peak in discoveries was exactly 40 years prior to the leveling off of this production graph, possibly echoing the gap between the peak of U.S. discovery and production. I'm soft-pedaling this to an enormous degree. This chart concerns me. Let me be blunt. If we are already at peak, as these data suggest is possible, then we're in trouble. However, the most urgent issue before us does not lie with identifying the precise moment of peak oil. That is, truthfully, an academic distraction because the economic dislocations will begin as soon as there's a gap between supply and demand. Here's a very simple and clever way to think about the supply and demand problem that was developed by a Dallas geologist named Jeffrey Brown, which he calls the export land model. Suppose we have a hypothetical country that produces 2 million barrels of crude a day, but that is declining at 5% a year. We'd note that they'd be able to export 2 million barrels, and then after 10 years, they would still be able to export 1.25 million barrels a day. This seems manageable. But now suppose that this country uses oil themselves, as all countries do, and they are consuming 1 million barrels a day, and this internal demand is itself increasing at 2.5% a year. This is also reasonable. What happens to exports under this model? They go to zero in 10 years. Where we expected exports, we get nothing. This is the miracle of compounding, but in reverse, where exports are eaten into from both ends. It turns out that this is a very realistic scenario because we can already observe that production is declining even as demand is increasing in a number of countries. In the case of Mexico, currently the number